you don't have the opportunity to provide public comment separately to the commission. You do. This is just really we're kind of double dipping here to give you as much opportunity to look at the proposed rules and talk about them with us before we get there. And so within that proposed rule package, again, there's the electronic monitoring. There's also some gear marking requirements, some updates to the WATICS fish ticket application process, and then I'll, toward the end, orient you to the commission schedule where you can get information on the rules and actually review the rule language yourself and the compliance guide yourself. And then we'll plan to be done by 5 o'clock. Any questions about the agenda before we move on? Okay. Next slide, Jamie. Would. So again, like I said, the rule package itself, it appears fairly large, but there, with the exception of electronic monitoring, the other changes that are included in here are relatively minor. In many cases, those rule changes only affect Puget Sound. So what we've got that's really more specific to coastal crab and coastal shellfish are, one, the electronic monitoring component, that's a new rule. And then a change to the commercial crab logbook requirement, which basically just says if you're using the electronic monitoring or when you're using electronic monitoring, you're not required to submit a logbook. So we needed to make that change. There's a rule change that would clarify our current line marking rule, and really I can go into that, but it's not changing the line marking requirement except to clarify that the 12 inches that you're marking needs to be continuous. This rule, it came up during our stakeholder outreach meetings last summer and fall, hearing from folks that, you know, while we tried to keep the line marking rule fairly broad so people could use the tools that worked best for them, there was a request that we provide some clarity to that. I imagine that'll be ongoing too. And then along with the line marking, though, included in this package is a rule that would prohibit line marks or colors that are required in another fishery. This builds on what ODFW did in their rule package a couple of years ago. So, you know, it would protect, if line marking in Washington is red, it would make sure that folks in California or Oregon aren't also using red, and just really help us get to that goal of having some real clarity in our West Coast gear marking regimes so that we can better associate entanglements with specific fisheries. And I'll talk a little more about that. There's just some rule clarifications that standardize our crab and shrimp pot buoy colors. No change that's likely going to impact everybody. It's just a clarification to the existing rule. One thing that you will be impacted by is this requirement to register crab buoy color schemes annually. We also have a new tool for doing that should simplify the process and build a system that's better able for us to track these buoy color schemes, which feeds right into the whole gear marking concept. And then I mentioned in the agenda, there's changes to the WATICS regulation, and including the fish ticket and transportation ticket reporting revisions. So let's see, next slide, Jamie.
I moved it already.
Thank you. And so just to give you a heads up, there's some of the other rule changes here that have less impact on the coastal crab or coastal shellfish fisheries and are more related to Puget Sound, but that you'll see if you review the rule language, there's changes that define a new management category for non-spot shrimp species, Puget Sound commercial pot shrimp rules, shellfish harvest logs. Again, this is a Puget Sound component, buoy tags in the Puget Sound crab fishery. A lot of these rule changes that are for Puget Sound also just provide clarity to existing language. And they're also, so including the Puget Sound shellfish fisheries in the rule package that we were bringing forward is a way to be efficient with our time with the commission. And also, as we've talked with our counterparts in Puget Sound, it's a way for us to fold in some of the gear marking changes that we've made on to coastal shellfish fisheries to the Puget Sound. And, you know, they're thinking ahead in the potential, although they haven't had an issue so far, but what if they need to go down the path of a conservation plan or risk reduction measures, and having this gear marking requirements and having some real clarity in those will help them in that process. And so just for folks who maybe haven't been engaged or able to attend any of our stakeholder meetings last summer, the gear marking, which includes line marking, buoy color, and buoy brand registration, is a component of entanglement monitoring. And so when we think of monitoring, I think a lot of people think of just seeing an entangled well, but from the point of view that we have a very clear approach to marking gear for the crab fishery, it's a way, and we coordinate that with the other states and federal fishery managers. It's a way to improve the entanglement reporting, and it supports our goal of being able to attribute entanglements to specific fisheries. This, and just for your awareness, NOAA has been very clear with the 3 West Coast states that this component to address marine life entanglements is really going to be necessary to secure an incidental take permit. So there's ongoing conversations about gear marking on the West Coast. Right now, we're the only state that has the line marking requirement, and we see that'll be an evolving discussion, which we'll engage with you. But for right now, we're just making that clarification to our line marking requirement and then building them in some other requirements for Puget Sound pot fisheries. So the next slide, Jamie. So again, going back to where we really want to focus time, because it is one of the bigger changes. It's a new requirement, is on rules related to implementing electronic monitoring. And I'll say electronic monitoring is something we've been talking about for a very long time in the crab fishery. And even back into 2017, I think was the first time we, as an agency, applied for funding, grant funding, to try to get some money to test electronic monitoring systems. We weren't successful until 2020, but we then did get a pilot project, which many of you are aware of, and Robert leads that project. So we've been testing electronic monitoring since then. The project is still ongoing today with some funds that we use from our agency to run it out through the end of this year. And then we talked more specifically about electronic monitoring and its ability to contribute to what we're going to need through the conservation plan and the incidental take permit, what we need in terms of spatial data as managers. So the slide we have here is one, if you've attended these meetings that we've been holding over the last couple of years, you know, what is electronic monitoring? And the one that we're proposing here is one that can determine a vessel position. It also determines pot hauling activity with a hydraulic pressure sensor, and then it takes that data and transmits it to an electronic monitoring service provider. The service provider that we're using in our pilot project is Archipelago, and they have electronic monitoring systems all over the world, but we first heard about Archipelago in, I don't even know if it was the 2000s, but years and years ago, in how in their work to help the Dungeness crab fishery in Canada, specifically at the north end of Vancouver Island, monitor their fishery. So also on this slide is, why do we need electronic monitoring? And just overarching, spatial data has become more important to effective fishery management. And some of the slides that you saw last year at our stakeholder meeting, we showed kind of data that we're getting from logbooks and our logbook compliance, and just the huge delay that we have in getting that logbook data available for us to use for management. It's a really important tool for enforcement, particularly in Washington, where we have closed areas and we have different lines where the season starts at different times. And so it'll help us with these closed area management that will really contribute to our co-management efforts with the coastal treaty tribes. Then it will improve our ability to enforce those requirements. So it will help with enforcement. And then it'll also, the spatial data that we'll collect with that will really help us build models to better understand where whales are and where our fishery are. And that helps us do a better job of effectively reducing the risk of entanglements with whales. So there's a linkage to both management, enforcement, and our conservation plan. And the proposed rule that we'll be reviewing today and that you'll have the opportunity to comment on will require all vessels that are participating in the coastal Dungeness crab fishery to have electronic monitoring. And there is a Washington Administrative Code, that's WAC 220, 340, 400, and it defines what commercial crab fishing means. And I'll just read that to you. It means any taking, fishing, use, or operation of gear to fish for crab for commercial purposes, and includes the possession of crab on the water for commercial purposes and the landing or initial delivery of crab for commercial purposes. So the rule for electronic monitoring incorporates the definition of commercial fishing, and basically this, so you understand that the commercial crab fishing means as long as you have gear in the water, you need to have an electronic monitoring system. Okay. So just one more slide and then I'm going to kick it over to Robert. So again, we really wanted to provide an opportunity to for you to hear about the electronic monitoring rule in particular as we work through the commission process. And we know this is a new idea. We want to describe how we view and can see the steps for implementation as we go forward. And so what you have here on this slide, and we'll talk about each one of these steps as we go through, but really the first part of it is reviewing this WAC language, or that's the rule language. And we also have developed a compliance guide that helps just break down the rule requirements and answer some questions in plain talk of how do I do this, or where do I get this form? So orienting yourself to those rules in the compliance guide, and then moving from there into, getting the electronic monitoring system, how you activate it, how you let us know that you've activated, and what to do as you go through the process of getting ready to start the commercial crab fishery. So I'm going to hand it off to Robert here to walk through some of these details in the next few slides.
Yeah, so the proposed rule would require all vessels participating in coastal crab fishery to install and maintain a vessel monitoring system that determines a vessel's position, records individual pot retrieval via a hydraulic pressure reading, and transmits this information to an EM system service provider. So it'll need all of these components, and it'll also need a feedback mechanism, and that would be required so operators can determine that the system is functioning properly. And so you'll know as you go out to fish that, yep, this thing's working, I'm good to go. So we're gonna step through some of those as we move.
When are these available?
What's that?
When are they available? Electronic monitoring?
The systems?
Yeah.
We're gonna talk more about that as we go through.
Hey, Robert and Heather,
Yeah.
just want to pause here. There's in the chat, a message from Jennifer Custer saying she initially couldn't see the slides advancing. And so I'm just curious if anyone else is experiencing that issue as well.
Okay, you guys should be seeing a slide that says EM system requirements as the heading, and then the EM system must, and there's 5 bullets there.
Okay. Yeah, and Larry
Okay.
says they're advancing for him. So I'm seeing them. I'm also remote. So Jennifer, it might be on your end. But let us know.
Sometimes leaving and rejoining the call will reset that.
Yeah.
I feel like Jennifer had struggles.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Try
that's
log
what it sounds
in,
like.
log
Try
out.
that, Jennifer.
Okay, and I'm gonna keep moving since this is a fairly short meeting. So yeah, systems will be required to have a hydraulic pressure crab block to determine pot hauling activity. And we recognize that the current language regarding this requirement in the proposed rules isn't feasible with most hydraulic systems, and we're proposing this alternative language that allows fishers to determine. So yeah, those two, you'll see the current language
I'm sorry,
there.
Robert, it's kind of cutting out a little bit, and I'm on a phone connection, so I don't know.
No,
Just
it did
kinda
for me
going
too,
in and out.
Hillary. Yeah,
Okay.
it did for me too.
Yeah, I'll try and speak up a little bit. Maybe
Okay.
it's not picking me up. So yeah, I'll just read this out for those that are on the phone. The current language is the hydraulic pressure sensor must be installed between the crab block and the first fitting from the crab block on the main line of the vessel that controls it, such that recorded pressure readings are indicative of pot hauling activity. So we realize that, there's quite a few fittings between the crab block and the actual hydraulic pump, and that would not be the ideal location for a sensor. And we're suggesting an alternative language is the hydraulic pressure sensor must be installed on the main high pressure supply line between the hydraulic pump and the crab block of a vessel that controls it, such that recorded pressure readings show pressure increases during pot hauling activity. So that makes it much more generic and allows fishermen to decide where that location would best be.
And Robert, if I could just add before you move on, I just wanted to say to, so this particular language is something that came up at our stakeholder meetings last fall, where we were walking folks through this, and it was brought to our attention that it would be important to define where that hydraulic pressure sensor is in the line, because there could be a way to bypass that pressure reading. And so this is a way to clearly explain where we need that in a way that doesn't allow that bypass to happen. So I know Robert has reached out to some of the folks that are in the pilot program and Captain Chadwick's team to see that this alternative language does a better job of describing it than the way we initially thought it should read. So thanks, Robert. Excuse me.
Yeah, and a system must also be installed in such a way that is powered anytime commercial crab gear is in the water or when commercial crab fishing according to the WAC, as Heather said earlier. And it also, system should not be installed behind structures that cannot be easily accessed for inspection. Did we accidentally jumped ahead a little bit there? So there's also going to be new reporting requirements with the electronic monitoring systems. And one of those is activation reports. Activation reports will be needed to determine the system is active and link the data coming from the system to the correct crab license. These reports will need to be submitted annually before the season starts. And anytime there's a change to the information required on the activation report, such as a change in vessel made to a license, a new system's installed, or you change service providers. Activation reports will also need to be submitted after operating under a temporary EM exemption permit or after submitting a departure report, which we'll go over those next. So these reports are critical for getting accurate data to PSMFC, Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. And this is how we link the data coming from the system to the vessel, so we know who's who. And this report, what will happen here, fishermen will fill out this report, send it in to us, and then we will give a confirmation that we've received the report, we see the system's functioning, and you're ready to enter the fishery. So during the crab season, if you experience a system failure or you need to temporarily turn off the system due to an emergency or scheduled maintenance, you're going to haul the vessel out for a period of time and cut power to the system, you would need to request an EM exemption permit and contact your service provider to schedule a maintenance call if necessary, if something's wrong. After receiving the exemption permit, fishers will need to record any fishing activity in a paper logbook. So this is, the system's not working for some reason. You are going out fishing anyway under an exemption permit. You'll need to fill out a paper logbook just as we do now, or an approved electronic logbook. And then prior to the permit expiring, fishers must submit an activation report to confirm the system is active. And then at that time, they could discontinue recording paper logbooks or re-enter the fishery in the case of a temporary departure due to emergency or haul out. So these temporary exemption permits will be needed anytime there's an interruption to the EM system while fishing for crab. If your EM system is not working properly, you would need to request a system failure exemption permit. We intend to make this permit available 24/7 by filling out an online form and receiving email confirmation to allow operators to continue fishing. This would be for up to 3 days while awaiting maintenance, and those could be extended if needed. But they would have to be requested. Haul out and emergency permits could be requested from WDFW EM program staff. And the permit dates on those can be extended to fit the operator's need, because in those situations, obviously you would not be actively fishing. And so if a vessel will no longer be participating in the Dungeness crab fishery and wishes to turn off the EM system before the season ends, they would have to submit a long-term departure report, and then they could deactivate the system. So a long-term departure report would be a simple notification process that the vessel will no longer be making a landing. You're heading off to another fishery, doing something else. it could be because simply you finished fishing for the season. Or it could be in cases where the vessel has an emergency or maintenance that will prevent them from participating in the fishery for the remainder of the season. So a breakdown that's gonna, essentially, you're not gonna be able to go out and continue fishing. Just let us know, oh, I'm done for the season. Or you go to another fishery, let us know you're done for the season, and then at that time you can turn off the EM system. And so as part of the rulemaking process, we've included a compliance guide with the rulemaking package to provide further details to help fishers comply to the EM. And that contains further information on what components are needed, how to install and ensure the system is operational, how to request and submit these reports and permits we just went over, and who to contact if you need any assistance. Any of those. So we're gonna take a break, and because the main part of this rule package is the electronic monitoring portion of it, we're gonna do some questions now on that section, and then we're gonna talk about those other parts of the rule package.
Robert, there's Doug Davis had a question in the chat that we could maybe start with. And it's about this idea that the system needs to be powered 24/7. And what does that mean for boats that don't have shore power?
Yeah, the system draws very little. So if you're actively fishing, this system, it's not a video system or something like that. So the power draw is very low. So it would take quite a few days to draw your batteries down if you're actively fishing.
What if they're tied to the dock for 7 days?
That should be fine. It can be compatible with 12 or 6 volt power,
Okay.
but the systems we're testing are 12 volt.
Larry has a hand raised. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Uh-huh.
So, I have been consistent, and one of my concerns anyway is that, this is a radical departure from present fisheries management. We did have several surveys that showed that there was fleet support for electronic monitoring. I'm not questioning that. I also know that the devil is always in the details. And relative to that, my initial concern when we asked for the grant was to make sure that whatever system we do put in place, if indeed there's system failures or extenuating circumstances where someone either has a failure with the system or some sort of installation issues, that they are not subject to being held at the dock and have a loss of fishing time that can equate to tens of thousands of dollars. So in part, there's two things. There's kind of a process that I think, is a little different after you get a season of this program under your belt. It would be more like normal operating conditions where you would expect to have certain and specific failures versus the rollout year where you may have issues that you wouldn't have in following years, such as supply chain issues, familiarity issues, such like that. So I continue to have those concerns. I'm not completely sure if our compliance regs or compliance to the rule portion captures all of that. But those are some outstanding things that I'm concerned about. So relative to the exemption permit, it sounds like obtaining one is going to be available 24/7. I would like to see that there might be a phone number Also, rather than, have to do it through an online app,
Mhm.
or a phone app, not everybody has the same digital talents as us. There can be failure, an online link. So, I mean, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. You could, and especially in the first year, like I say, have a number that you could call if you had a failure be able to use the app. And then
Mhm.
you could leave a message saying, I have a problem, but I can't stay here to resolve it. I got to go fishing. I have a problem. I've notified you. So something more expansive relative to that, I think, is going to be extremely helpful. I also have some question. There seems to be a significant, or there seems to be relative ease to secure an exemption permit, but in lifting it and reinstating it, it seems to be less flexible because I think it says that you have to call the EM team. You have to contact the team. So you can't, then let's say you had a haul out emergency and you got an exemption for being hauled out because you had to interrupt power. And then it's time to go fishing and you came in quickly to get it done. And now you want to go fishing and you have to actually call and talk to the team in order to take, your vessel, launch it, and then go right out onto the grounds. So it seems to me that the reinstatement portions of the compliance guide may not be as helpful as the initial request for an exemption certificate. I know there's others that want to comment. I have more to say as we move forward here. And then I do think that there really needs to be an understanding that there has to be enforcement flexibility, especially in the first year, as we feel through this major rollout of a new management measure. And I would certainly hope that that discretion and understanding of the difference between the intent of a rule and its effect on the management and just a failure to meet a rule, whether or not it has a management implication. And that we need to have, especially like I say, the first year, as much flexibility as possible as we work our way through this, assuming it's approved.
Yeah, I think, Larry, I'll get started. Robert might have more to add. I do want to say that, appreciate your comments and we heard them very similar comments during stakeholder meetings last fall when we were, reaching the end of our pilot project and wanted to share folks kind of a vision of what this would look like. Not stranding anybody at the dock was heard loud and clear. And that's why you'll see, if you read the rule language and even what we've shown here, just through the diagrams, we've really attempted to plot out a system where that works, where we don't want someone tied up and losing tens of thousands of dollars. We want to make sure there's a process and a backup process for that to work. And I just want to say, I think, one, we've implemented a lot of novel ideas in this crab fishery since I've been involved. The first one I was involved in was pot limits. And then from there, buoy tags. And it was a big deal. It was a big change. It was significant. And I feel that we have worked with stakeholders in a kind of a partnership on making these changes and these big steps from how we're used to doing things. And I've been thinking a lot about how we think about the first year of this program too. And it's new. It's not new technology. We have a lot of electronic monitoring for vessels that's going on. Pacific states are experts in collecting that data from partners like Archipelago. And anyway, what I'm getting at, kind of drifting away from that, is I also view the first year of this as a partnership and us working with you and getting over hurdles and managing challenges. One thing that we heard through the pilot project folks was that at least the folks that are testing these systems now haven't had many problems, but we also know we're going to be available to navigate those in this first year in particular. And so thinking about how to characterize that, I know, anyway, it's something that we've appreciated, that input we've heard. We've tried to build those mechanisms in. I really think your input there on getting the activation reports. So not only being able to get an exemption permit that allows you to keep fishing, but then reinstating your activation requirement is something we can look at and make sure that we have a smooth process. And we talked a lot about the fact that not everybody has the same technology skills as everybody else. So thanks for that.
If I could just, before you move on to somebody else, there is one other piece, and that is, if indeed we have some of the supply chain issues, and access to installers if need be by some fishers rather than self-install, and that they present a greater problem than we ever expected in this first rollout year, I'd be interested in knowing what kind of options that you might be able to make potentially across the board for the fleet, such as an emergency rule that might roll back the actual implementation date if we confront problems we never foresaw, on a wholesale scale, on a large scale, not specific to each individual.
Yeah.
I mean, there are individual circumstances, and in our other programs that you mentioned earlier, we had what were called extenuating circumstances in many cases. And I don't actually see extenuating circumstance language in these rules or in the compliance document as it stands. But so thanks for your answer.
Well, I just, if that was, yeah, we don't want to throw y'all out to the wolves and set you up with a no-win situation. If we don't have systems or something's not working, we're not going to go, well, we're just going to go for it and you're on your own. We'll address extenuating circumstances so that we're not setting this up for failure, for sure.
Right. Well, it's not necessarily captured in rule, and it's helpful to have, sometimes having flexibility and broad guidelines is good. Also having some indication by the managers and enforcement that attitude of flexibility is going to be, stretched more so likely in the first year than the following year. I just continue to have some really fundamental concerns about having some sort of punitive actions when the circumstances really wouldn't, in most people's minds, justify such a punitive take. So that's just a fear, and hopefully, saying that you're going to be flexible, I appreciate and honor your words. I'm not saying that they are not appropriate. I appreciate them, but I as it goes into functionality and in the field and application, I hope those words hold true. Thanks.
Wake up, Jungie.
I have a slide that's scheduled for a little bit later. I'm not seeing any hands or any questions. So maybe I'll jump ahead to slide 21, Jamie, and just share with folks another thing that's been happening behind the scenes as we start thinking about what this looks like. We have another thing that we heard during our stakeholder meetings, an issue that was concerning to people was the idea of funding these electronic monitoring systems. So we've been thinking a lot about that and what we can do about that. And so there's a couple of avenues that we've been working on to help offset the costs of these EM systems. Starting with the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. This one is really exciting. We're waiting for final approval on the system, so I can't confirm that we'll get this funding, but I can say that it's very promising. If we do get the approval, the funding would be available to supply the systems along with our implementation timeline for electronic monitoring. It's likely to cover the costs to support EM systems for participants. It would provide the system, but vessel operators would still be responsible for associated costs that involve the installation and activating a data plan. I have been talking with folks at Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission around what does it look like when we get the money and order the system. So we're speaking in a way and we're talking and planning in a way as if that funding will come through. Again, we're just waiting for final approval on that. And I will follow up for sure, but in my conversations with Pacific States, we're both very excited about the opportunity to be able to do that. And Pacific States, we're very grateful for them to explore this with us. I know they're also very interested in helping Oregon and California similarly, so that we have that great consistent rule and requirements across our West Coast Dungeness crab fishery. So I want you to be aware of that as we continue talking about what it looks like through the rulemaking process and navigating the implementation requirements. The funding part is something that I hope to get back to you on very soon about that. There's another grant proposal we submitted through the community roadmap process that Michelle Conrad was working on with several community members. We're talking about the Dungeness crab fishery and electronic monitoring. Worked with Michelle to submit a pre-proposal for a Saltonstall Kennedy grant. It's a competitive grant application. The actual, we would be notified if we're invited to submit a full proposal, I believe in November. And the money then obviously wouldn't be available until 2024, but it could be a reimbursement of the costs. It's very similar funding proposal as what we have for Pacific States. And so we think that it would reimburse the cost of systems for Washington participants, but it would be done on a reimbursement basis just because of the timeline. So those two things are in the work. I think the Pacific States funding is very promising, and I hope to be able to provide some confirmation of that here soon. Well, do you have a question, Larry? Okay.
Yeah, I do. So what is the asked for an implementation date then of the having the system installed and active? I mean, what is that expectation, and would there potentially be some flexibility in that again if we had some of the problems I was speaking to earlier? And then I appreciate the attempt to try to get some potential reimbursement funding. I mean, if that were to come to pass, that would certainly be a welcome. That would certainly be welcome by the fleet, especially when there's been some talk of this system may not be the system that we're going to end up with or that we would like to see over time. And that this might possibly be a system that you'd buy now, and then there might be another proposal, down the pike a ways, which, those double costs would be,
Mhm.
tougher to take than if you could defer or defray the cost of one of them anyway. I would remind the Quinaults now are on their third electronic monitoring system. So they've had 3 different styles of systems that they've gone through. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, really good question. And I had a similar thought too. One of the other things that we heard loud and clear, and we haven't talked about it in this presentation. The last meeting we held, we let you all know that while there's interest in having a system that doesn't just record vessel location, but also records video. And in our investigation of that, and that's really the primary reason we used our agency funds to extend the pilot project, was to learn a bit more about video. And what we did learn is we have a lot more questions than answers at this point. So we aren't taking video off the table by any means, but we have some work to do to look deeper into that and explore that. And so I had a similar thought to you, Larry, that if we could do this in a stepwise fashion, I think we're learning a lot from Quinault, and they have gone to video, and yet I don't know that any of their vessels actually utilized their video because they had problems with it all last season. So I think we'll get to learn a lot about video from Quinault. They of course have also a smaller fleet, and video storage is a hurdle that we'll have to figure out how to navigate down the road if that's where we want to go. But then having the funding, I think, makes it easier to think about a phased process and, live out the life of this EM system or not if we get to video sooner than when these systems need to be replaced, then we haven't asked you to pay for these 2 systems. So anyway, I just wanted to echo that idea that I think it really helps us bridge the desire to implement electronic monitoring, and then give us some time to look at what it means to include a video component. Yeah, go ahead, Lorna.
Oh, I thought I was muted all this time, so hopefully I have not created a lot of noise. Anyways, just want to clarify with the Pacific States funding, they would be purchasing the units and we would be delivering units to the crabbers. That isn't a reimbursement process. Do I understand that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
You
the
said that and I
benefit
missed
of
it. Okay.
yeah, that's the benefit of the Pacific States. And to get at Larry, your first question, that's a bit of I got myself a bit ahead by moving to this slide first, but I'll walk through the implementation timeline next. We'll get to that and what that looks like. But you're right, Lorna, the Pacific States money would come and you would have no out-of-pocket money for the system. So Jamie, if we could go back to slide 16. Larry, is your hand a new hand up?
Hey,
Before we go
Heather,
back?
I don't know how to put my hand up on this. You hear me?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Hey, this is Greg McMillan. Are these what you're thinking about requiring is are these the units that are currently on boats now?
Yes.
Minus the video, I guess we could say. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Does anybody else on the phone have a question? That's a good reminder that y'all can't raise your hand, and maybe before I jump into some of the others, just give folks a chance to chime in.
I just want to add something to Greg. There would be no electronic logbook requirement. I know we've had that requirement with the pilot program, but we're dropping the logbook completely. So there would be no electronic logbook, no paper logbook.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought, because I knew we had like 2 systems on the boat, one the electronic log and then the monitoring. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, well, I'll finish out these slides and we'll have some time here at the end if there's any follow-up questions. So these other slides also are, again, really focused on the parts of the rules that affect coastal shellfish. This one here elaborates a little bit on what I said, but basically the point is for the change in the rule for the logbook requirement just removes that you will be responsible for submitting logbooks if you have a functional electronic monitoring system. And then what it does is it builds in a backstop. If you're operating under a exemption permit, then you can fill out a logbook for those trips. And only those trips where your EM system isn't operating. And otherwise, what we have, and this, we talked a little bit more in detail about this at other meetings, but the idea of the hydraulic pressure sensor recording rate of recording that pressure is we get a reading for basically every pot. So not only do we know your vessel track line, but we have a good understanding of when the vessel is fishing. So that hydraulic pressure records when you're retrieving a pot. But if you're on your way back to Westport, it's clear your hydraulics aren't running and you're not fishing. And so that helps us with the not needing a logbook. Next slide, Jamie.
I got a
Was there a
question,
question?
Heather.
Okay.
So, and I'm not, I might be way out of bounds, but what happens to an individual that is, let's just say he's using his block to run longline gear or his hydraulic system to, the same system to run longline pots or any other fishery with that boat? Is he able to call in and turn it off for that fishery, or how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a question for Robert, and I'll take a shot in that the pattern of the hydraulics would be clear that you're not running a pot, that you're running a long line, but I'll leave this to the resident expert, Robert.
If somebody ran out in the river to run sport crab pots with their boat, and it wasn't a Dungeness crab season, and they turn their block on to run that pot, because in the state, the river here, we're allowed to do that.
Yeah.
But it's not a crab season. I guess I'm just wondering, is this thing going to run 24/7 year round? So anytime somebody, let's say somebody goes and salvages pots, but he's not in the fishery, he's not fishing, but now all of a sudden he's out. There's other things that people do with their boat and their block and their hydraulics than crab, but now it seems like we're hooking the system to it and it's going to be on all the time. I guess is and maybe it's not. Maybe I'm way out of bounds. So.
Well, you're close, but I think the fact that the requirement that rule language that I read to you is specific to commercial crabbing. So if you're sport crabbing in the Columbia River and you don't have any commercial pots out, you don't need to have your system activated. So if you're doing that in November, that does not meet the definition of commercial crabbing. If you're doing gear recovery work and you have submitted your long-term exemption, so you have all your crab gear out of the water, then you wouldn't be required to have your system running.
I can see where guys participate in the halibut fishery here. Just for example, they're also crabbing, summer crabbing. So one day they're going to go in the halibut fishery The next day they're going to come back and go, is this the system where you're going to have to, like our VMS, where you've got to call in and turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off? That's my question, I guess, is there a way that you do that?
Yeah.
Turn it on, turn it off.
So yeah, if you have gear in the water, you would not be able to turn it off. It would still need to be on, and we would record that long line activity. For instance, for example, we have fishers that are participating in the pilot program that also do other fisheries as well. And we see that activity, but it's clear that activity is not coastal Dungeness crab activity. But it would be recorded, but not included in our coastal crab data set.
Right. So that guy that takes his boat and runs to Kodiak, for instance, and starts running crab gear in Kodiak is going to get recorded. There's no way for him to turn it off.
If he's going to Kodiak, and I would hope he doesn't have gear in the water and off Washington still, right? Then he could disconnect the system and not need
Okay,
it.
that's my question, Robert, is that you can turn it off and not be penalized, I guess, is what I'm
Yeah,
we're trying to get.
We don't have a requirement to make this tamper-proof or whatnot like that, so you just are required to have it if you have gear in the water. So when you don't have gear in the water, you can disconnect the system.
But that's where you fill out your departure report,
After you let us know, I'm done fishing, I'm going to Kodiak to fish for crab, okay, disconnect the system and go fish for crab. We don't want to know what's happening in Alaska.
Right.
But if there's gear in the water and you're participating in a halibut fishery, you would have to leave that system on.
Okay, that's I think that gets to some of the questions that Larry had about the ability to not get shut down or not be stuck at the dock while you're waiting to transfer from one fishery to another when you're a summer crabber that is running out here and fishing for 2 or 3 days of one fishery and wants to come back and run his crab. That's I get there's going to be a lot of those issues we're going to get in this first year or 2 years or whatever. There's going to be a lot of things that come up that we're going to scratch our head and go, oh, we didn't think about that. But
yeah, I think you make a really good point, Lance. Thank you.
Heather, this is Brian. I don't know how to raise my hand on the phone, but if I could jump in.
Yes.
Do we have to disconnect the system? I mean, do we have to disconnect the system once we quit participating in the crab fisheries? Is it mandatory? And if so, can you turn the system on and off manually on the vessel? I have the system. I'm just not really up on whether or not I can turn it off manually.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it all something we have to turn off with the state where they just disconnect it and don't take data anymore?
Yeah, so as long as it's connected to power, it's still going to be transmitting that data. You could, so there is a data plan with this. So that's going to be on each individual fisherman. So if you sign up for a data plan for only 6 months, then Archipelago is just not going to transmit the data if you don't have a data plan. So you could cancel your data plan, is one way to do it, or you could just disconnect the power to the systems. There's no manually way to shut it off other than disconnecting the power.
Okay, and I'm assuming disconnecting the power isn't what you guys want to do. Like, back to Lance's question, I have the system on the boat. I think it's more than obvious when I go prawn fishing that I'm not participating in Dungeness crab. And then, of course, if there is ever any question about whether you're longlining, you have to register whenever you leave the crab fisheries, unless it's another shellfish fisheries by law. You're supposed to register with either NOAA or National Marine Fisheries when you go black coding or halibut fishing. You just don't get to go without letting the federal government know. So, we're kind of covered there. I was I was just curious that when I'm done with the system and I'm done with crabbing, do I get in trouble if I disconnect the power? Because it is a battery. It is a 12-volt draw. It keeps our constant volts running. Just little things like that. Like Larry said, that I'm personally all for the system. Like Larry said, that the devil's in the detail, and so just little questions.
Yeah, do you have any more to add to that, Robert?
I mean, yeah, as long as there's no more gear in the water and you're going to another fishery, you're done crabbing for the season, there's no reason you can't disconnect it after you submit your departure report. Or leave it.
Okay. There's a question in the chat from Doug Davis.
Oh.
I think this one, I mean, I'll start, and this might be a question. Oh, Captain Chadwick's probably gone. But I mean,
I logged back
in
in,
your,
Heather.
oh, okay. So Doug Davis, for folks that are on the phone, has a question that says, how would we handle chasing strays or helping friends collect strays? And like, this is one of those, this is just common practice, what folks do, especially if it's after a storm or, whenever pots are scattered, and how you kind of deal with that. I assume this would be one of those situations that we've asked, like when you're doing something like this, or when you're going to put somebody else's pot on your boat, that's where the call to enforcement is. How to say, hey, there was a storm last week. I saw my buddy's gear up here. I'm gonna bring it back, and just a heads up. But I'm just throwing
Heather,
it
I
out
think
there.
this is Dan Chadwick. I think we're gonna have to kind of massage this one as it goes, just like the rest of this is implemented.
Uh-huh.
But we understand how the fishery works. If somebody's collecting strays, 2 days into the season without a storm, then we're gonna have a different issue than somebody collecting strays after a big storm that everybody's well aware of, and how the season progresses here. So we'll work through that as it goes.
And I just want to add here, and I've been talking to Lorna about this a little bit, and need to talk to you, Captain Chadwick, and your team. But in what one of Larry's earlier comments about, in response to me saying, hey, this is implementing something new for this fishery, and the first year we're going to have to navigate some hurdles. We can't even anticipate every hurdle we're going to have in front of us, but it's our intent to do that in a way, that doesn't strand people at the dock and all of that. And where we fit that's you don't put that in a rule language, but I do think it's appropriate to include that in the compliance guide. And I appreciate that, it's me just giving my word, and I'll need to talk again to Captain Chadwick, who's the enforcer of these rules. But, the idea is this first year will be us working together to identify some of those little things. I think Brian's question was a really good one, and Lance's about the directed halibut fishery or other fisheries, and what does that look like. I think Robert's had some really good experience of observing that in the data that we're already looking at through the pilot project. So he can tell when you're not running crab gear and you're like, oh, they're sablefish fishing, or maybe directed halibut. But anyway, I just wanted to again say that it's our intent, and we can include a description about how the first year of this, we see the first year of this playing out in the compliance guide or something like that.
And
So
I'll
let's
just
get,
add, Heather, just
okay,
really
please.
quick,
Yeah.
along those lines. The good news is the sergeants have been in place here for quite a few years and can help navigate, this fishery. And I mean, if we're talking to somebody about an issue multiple times within the first year, that's going to be different than somebody that just pops up and has an issue that we need to discuss and kind of get a course correction on that. So again, we'll just work through it. But I just want to say that we have some experienced supervisors here that know the fishery, to actually work the fishery, and we'll work through all these bugs.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just to work through a couple of these last slides here, also included in the rule package is gear marking. Larry, I'll go ahead before I get into this one.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up with Captain Chadwick, and certainly, again, my point was, especially the first year, that this is not really what you would call normal course of operation. So getting through the first year is going to need some extra flexibility, which seems to be acknowledged, which is good. I just wanted to say something specific again, kind of in line with what I mentioned about the haul out piece, where somebody might have an emergency haul out, they interrupt their power to the EM system, and then they have to reach out to the EM team in order to go fishing again, or they would start fishing without connected or without that authorization to reactivate. And you said you would look into that and address that. And I think that's really important, that we have some additional mechanism, which would be a 24/7 type of notice, similar to what you'd have in the initial request for the EM, or for the exemption. And I see that similarly would apply in the EM exemption permit extension, which within the compliance rule proposal. And so again, it says, that if you can't resolve your issue with the EM system, if you had an issue and you had gotten an exemption permit, and that you want to extend that exemption permit because you haven't been able to resolve the issue, you've been trying and you've been fishing on that exemption permit, and you want to still go fishing tomorrow, but your permit expired, you have to wait until you can contact the EM team instead of just calling or having an app where you can expect or ask or inform that system is still not operational, even though you've tried to make it so, that the issue is not resolved. So once again, that's just another place where the same issue that I pointed out in the haul out piece, also applies. So that we just need to I think, re-examine that one. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Her message heard. Basically, we need a system that says you got to activate it. If for any reason you have to pause your activation, you get a thing, an exemption permit, and then if you're going to reactivate it, or you have to reactivate it. And
dinner plans for you. Or you guys. So I said it's just me, and then
we're going to try to mute whoever's talking here.
I was like,
thank you. But basically what I'm hearing your comment is, regardless of the in and out, it needs to be a process that is, doesn't take time, that is easy to do. So I've heard that message, and I think it's good input. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to gear marking, and so I touched on these in the beginning here. So the rule change basically just clarifies that the line marking, which now just says is 12 inches of red up near the buoy and down near the pot, it just adds the word continuous. And then the prohibiting line marks or colors that are required in another fishery. This just really helps us have a line marking system, eventually a West Coast wide line marking system that is very clear, that like a red mark, for example, or red line is Washington, and the different color is Oregon. And so you don't want to be fishing with your red line down in California, and eventually California will have a rule that says if California is lavender and you're down here with red, you're in violation of California's rule. And that's to your benefit, to have that rule in place, so that the entanglements, say in California, aren't attributed to Washington because there's red line being used in California. And then standardizing the crab and shrimp pot buoy colors. So this says again, recreational crab buoys are red and white. And so if you're using commercial gear, your crab buoys can't be just red and white unless there's 30% of the buoy is marked in additional colors. And I think this is a rule in place in Puget Sound already. Okay, next slide, Jamie. Thank you. And then again, this is requiring an annual registration of crab buoy color schemes. And we'll have to do this annually, but we have a new online registration form, and I know Jamie's been helping people with that already, right?
Yes.
I think we've been doing some testing with that. This will really, really help with the registration process. We've taken a lot of pictures of buoy colors, and when I worked in Montesano, I could see someone driving in and bringing their buoys in to have the picture taken. This will be a better way to have a catalog of buoy colors that can be used by enforcement, or can be used to when there's an entanglement and you can see a buoy, but you can't see the buoy tag, or you can't see the line, you can see the buoy. We can either look through our record and say, no, that's not Washington, because we have this complete registration. And I know our buoy picture registration has been fairly incomplete.
So there's a question from Jennifer in the chat about whether this new online buoy registration system is different than the app we used this year.
It's the same. The same one, Jennifer. Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a couple of questions relative to the line marking, and then the prohibition of the use of a color that's going to be utilized in another fishery, not to be used, in the directed crab fishery within this rule. So to that one first, in the state of Washington, we have two distinct commercial crab fisheries. We have the coastal crab fishery and we have the Puget Sound crab fishery. And that is, at least in my mind, relative to the coastal fishery, that's an other fishery. So the rule apparently applies, to the other states, Oregon and California. They would put in reciprocal language, basically. And we would then put in the language that we would prohibit the use of a color that's being used in another fishery. And it's specific in the rule to Oregon and California. There's no mention of the differentiation between Puget Sound colors and Washington coastal colors. So I think that might potentially be a loophole that needs to be closed. So I would just steer you to that in case that you share the concern that I think I see. And then the other question is, I'm trying to understand how, and you and I had a conversation about, what does it mean to have a continuous red mark? It's more like a question what would be some of the examples of marks that have been utilized so far by different fishers that would not, in terms of enforcement, be considered a continuous mark? And if Captain Chadwick is still on the phone, which I hope he is, maybe he could describe what he has seen that he now would think wouldn't qualify under the addition of the use of the word continuous. When you and I spoke, I mean, it sounded like perhaps, still having another red tracer laced into the line that might be over the 12 inches, not tucked, every inch, but here and there to get to that might qualify. I'd like to know what doesn't qualify. So maybe we can know better what does qualify. We know the paint marks would qualify. I'd like to think that other alternative would likely qualify too, but perhaps we could get a little better understanding of that. I'm not sure what will be different, I guess, with the addition of the use of
It's about as easy as this, Larry. No zip ties. Some guys were just throwing a zip tie in there at 12 inches and calling it good.
Okay,
So
that's
it's got to be right down. So those tracers all the way down continuously 12 inches. So zip
yeah,
ties.
well, that's very helpful, Captain. Thank you. I appreciate that. So that would be fairly clear to people. No zip ties. Maybe we could put that in there. Anyway, thank you.
That's how it was brought to us at the meetings last summer. But on your first point, which to say good eye, I do think we've closed that loophole, and by saying other state fisheries, which would include Puget Sound, because very good point. We don't want red line used in the Puget Sound and this is where Puget Sound managers, and even in the stock assessment report, Larry, you might have noticed that there was an acknowledgement that some of these humpback whales are more often being observed in the Salish Sea. And so we have included other state fisheries. So even spot shrimp and Puget Sound crab if there's a requirement, you can't use that line in that fishery. So yeah, super good point.
Hey, Heather, this is Greg. I have a quick question.
Sure.
We talked about state-specific line last meeting, and I was wondering what are we doing with that? Would that be accepted as, because some of us are trying to get ahead of the curve, I guess, but would that be accepted as compliant to the rule?
Yeah. A really good question, Greg. And, this is something we've talked about within our tri-state crab group with our manager counterparts in Oregon and California. All of us really recognize the interest expressed by you all to have some certainty in what a state-specific line might look like. So it's on all of our to-do list to work on that. We have a meeting later this fall to talk about state-specific line marking, and that is the next step in the rulemaking. And so it's not included in this rule package. We don't have anything for you now to say what a state-specific line would look like, but we do want to get out there and get that rule making started with the idea that it would just be identifying the state colored line, the color scheme for the line, and that it would be phased in over years, so that you could start replacing your line sooner than later, and just include that natural replacement of your line in a way that'll meet the requirement in the future. But it's also it's a big that's another big change at a big cost. So part of our discussions in the tri-state group are funding opportunities to help with that, and some of the details about how much of your line would need to be marked. And I think Oregon's got a little bit farther down the process of talking about that with our stakeholders, but you can be prepared for us to bring that up in 2024 once we get this rolling. So good question, Greg. More to come on that.
Hey, Heather, this is Lance again.
Yeah.
Do you have an update where Oregon, being an Oregon license holder, or maybe Kelly's still in here, but do you have an update on where they are for this year with their line marking stuff, or California for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Kelly's still here. What I understand is that's not in their package for that they just went to the commission on. They had interest in doing that, but also realized that as they met with stakeholders, there's some questions as we meet with NIMS and say how much line is necessary to be marked. They had some more questions. So it's not part of the rule that they just took to the commission. But again, we're all looking to be coordinated to have some more details on that next year. I think California is interested in also getting it through their rulemaking process early in 2024. So there's a motivation to move forward, but it didn't happen for this year.
Heather, Doug has a question about the red line sold by England Marine, if that is legal, and then whether or not he needs to paint red marks. I guess, Doug, that suggests you're using red line already. So maybe you could speak to that.
If you have red line and your line is marked but and your line is okay.
Yeah, if it's all red, isn't it continuous? I mean, you exceed the rule requirement.
If your line is marked in that 12 inches near the pot and near the buoy, that's what I was just going to say, is you're meeting the requirement. It might not meet the requirement for a crab line down the road. Just a solid red mark may not.
Heather, the rule says it has to be within that first, no more than a fathom away from the pot, or no more than a fathom away from the buoy. The question is, if somebody has a shot of red line that goes past that fathom, do they need to then mark a darker red or a different red within that fathom? Or is that shot of line from the buoy down gonna suffice, gonna qualify or satisfy the law? What's the intent there, I guess? And then if they put a 12-inch down by the pot, because their line down at the pot is a different color, will that satisfy what we're after here?
To me, it satisfies what our current rule is.
Yes, I agree.
But may not meet that long-term line marking. But that's where, we'll re-engage with stakeholders on that once we get through this rulemaking. But to me, yes, as long as, like Lorna and Captain Chadwick said, it covers that 12 inches near the pot and near the buoy, at this point, our current rule language would allow that.
Hey, Heather, can I jump in really quick? Like I said, I don't know how to raise my hand, but
okay.
Now to get to the long-term line marking. Larry Stevick and I talked about it a little bit, and I read the numbers of what they think it's going to cost. And those numbers might be correct for Oregon and California, but I don't think those numbers are even relatively close for Washington, because I think 20 fathom a line. I don't know if this goes through tri-state, if we all got to use the 20 fathom model, that 20 fathom model is a very, very bad idea for Washington because our shelf is so wide. You know, we don't have near as much coastline as Oregon or California, but we got more fishing grounds because of how far out our shelf is. Our shelf is per fathom. So once you get below Coos Bay and you start getting a really narrow shelf, it's pretty common that guys don't use half-inch line. They use 7/16. So they can start with a 20 fathom bottom shot, and then when they add rope, they can just add the rope to the pot, as opposed to up here, we add the rope where the buoys were. Everybody up here uses half-inch line. So we would need a 20 fathom bottom shot to fish out the 15 fathom. Then when we go to 23 fathom, we're going to need another 10 fathom bottom shot or 10 fathom top shot to keep continuous, to have the 20 fathom continuous law. Then when we go out to 28 fathom, we got to take that 10 fathom off and put another 20 fathom on, because if we just threw too much line on it, then we are going against what you guys don't want for too much scope. To meet that provision in Washington, we don't need 20 fathom of line. We need 50 fathom of line, and I did the math, and it comes in at $49,000. So while that 20 fathom might work for Oregon and California because they traditionally fish a lot longer lines, a lot of guys down there fish 3/8 inch bottom shots. We don't do that in Washington because we get sanded in so much. We get blown up out in 20 fathom. And I'm really, really hoping, if they don't do an economic impact study on this, that we cut that down to 10 fathom, because this is going to be so costly for Washington. It's going to be ridiculous. Not so much for California, not so much for Oregon, because traditionally they use a lot more rope than we do. They don't use big, heavy ropes like we do. When they go to lengthen out, you need that 20 fathoms, they can just break it at the pot and throw a line under it. That's not how we lengthen out here. We lengthen out on top of our line, under the buoys. So I've been wanting to write something, and I've talked to Larry about it a little bit, but, you know, as things go on, that needs to be addressed, because you're looking at around $49,000 for a guy like me to be compliant if I want to fish out to 30 fathom.
I really appreciate you thinking about these details. I completely, the cost is mind blowing when you look at the whole West Coast or whatever. It's mind blowing about what the cost is. If electronic monitoring is like this compared to a lot changing line, which is the phase in idea, but the details that you're getting at, we really, really need that. We're going to have to rely on the advisory board or some kind of a working group to figure that out. And let me just explain what we've heard from NOAA so you can keep thinking about it. We need to think about what an analysis looks like. What we've heard from NOAA is that they're going to be looking to see that 30% of all the line in the water is marked. And so that will get us to whether 20 fathom or 15 fathom or 10 fathom is appropriate. But what we'll need, and what you're saying to me that's eye-opening and helpful, is that shelf, and how we fish is different than Oregon and California. We'll go into how we evaluate what's our baseline, how much line do we have in the water at any given time based on the depth of the fishery, what's 30% of that, and what does that equate to in terms of the kind of the fathom we're going to get to. So all 3 states are going to be using that 30%, and that's going to be how we can quantify our ability to meet the goal, the line marking requirement. But again, it's a big conversation. I don't want to minimize it at all, and we'll get started on that right away. And again, I really appreciate you guys thinking about it and helping us understand the differences for our state. so that we can do that. And then also, I think what we heard from Oregon as they initiated the conversations in Oregon was to just, maybe it was you, Greg, that actually said this at our meeting, is having some coordination among the 3 states. So in that way, I think what you said, Greg, when we met last was, don't make it different for each state, but it might need to be different. So anyway, we will have to think really carefully about that and rely on you all to help us understand, what is happening on the water as we start looking to consider a rule. So thank you, Brian.
And one more thing I'd like to add to that. So a lot of guys around here are traditionally beach fishermen. I just stacked 140 pots out of 15 feet of water. Do I need 120 fathom of line and 15 feet of water? And the direction we're going to go with all this, guys are going to buy sinking line and neutral buoyant line, which jacks that price up. I saw the 2 different prices for an economic impact, and one was with floating line and one was with a neutral buoyant line. Again, I ran my numbers at $49,000 if you want to fish out to 40 fathom. After that, you can take your 20 fathom top shot off and start putting whatever color line under it. I don't have my numbers with me right now because I'm on the ocean. This equates to almost $9 million to get it to compliance if everybody wants to be able to fish from 20 feet to 40 fathom. And to do this, I don't know how it's going to work. I think there's got to be an economic impact. And if California and Oregon want to do it differently than Washington, just 20 fathom of line in Washington is way, way too much. Do you guys want us to be in 15 feet of water with 120 feet of rope? Because I don't do that, and I don't know too many people that do that. But anyhow, you get the point. I'll leave it alone.
Okay. No, thanks for bringing it up. It's next on the to-do list. So, Larry, go ahead. It'd be your hands, a new raised hand.
Thank you. So I did want to speak to the red mark continuous issue that we were talking about earlier, but just briefly to the eventual inclusion of a requirement of state-specific line and fishery-specific line. I mean, that's going to be a pretty complicated path to walk. It's also going to have to deserve a very long phase-in time in order to be able to handle the kind of costs that it will likely be. But I would first of all like to say that we need to be ready to push back on the idea that NIMS has already established that 30% of the line is what needs to be done to serve tanglement attribution. Frankly, if you're fishing in 40 fathoms and you're using 60 or 50 fathoms of line or 55 fathoms of line to mark 30% of that line, because you think that's what's required in order to compensate for it, or at least be able to identify an entanglement of a whale. I'd like to know how many whales are entangled, more than 100 feet under the water on a crab line. So I'm not sure that NOAA's basis for the 30% is based on research, on entanglement research. And as you and I spoke some, and Brian referenced that we have quite a bit, it seems to me that we need to establish, what is the need of marking below the buoy, because most entanglements, from what I understand, are in the upper levels, upper reaches of the line. And the girth of a humpback, I'm not exactly sure what it is. But if we were to have like 10 fathoms of line at the top marked, I mean, that would be 60 feet of line. And I'm not sure what the girth of a humpback is, but I'll bet it's within that 60. And even if he wrapped up, at 70 feet, there'd still be some of that red line on, or the designated line within the entanglement area likely to occur. So my point is, there's a lot of discussion that has to happen. And I don't think we should at the gate say that, well, no, NIMS has now said 30%. I think we need to push back on that to understand why indeed that 30% is what would be needed, especially for a line that might be 60, 50 fathoms long. But anyway, so
Yeah.
that's relative to that. But the other piece was, so as we were discussing about the red line in Washington, that would meet Washington's law, and that's good that it does, and I'm glad that that's considered as being within the parameters of what's legal in Washington. But what it does do, and I'm not saying we should change anything at this juncture because there's so much more to do on line marking. But people use red line in Oregon and California too. So a continuous red line does satisfy Washington law, but there's no prohibition on the use of a red line in Oregon and California at this juncture.
There is in Oregon. There is in Oregon.
At this right now, you can't use a red line, or you just can't use a red mark.
You can't use a red mark as required in another state.
No,
well,
I understand that.
It
That's
maybe be up for interpretation, but
Yeah.
I agree.
Right. So I'm just saying that the red line does satisfy Washington law, and that's good. But I am saying I don't think there's an exclusion for the use of a red line, not a red mark, but a red line in either Oregon or California. So that can be problematic, but we're early in line marking experiences and development of rules that will satisfy that eventual needs for the incidental take permit. I just wanted to mention those things, so thanks.
Yep, you bet. Okay. Let's see. Next slide. Watix. So this you'll also see in your review of the rule changes, that there are changes that are proposed to the Watix electronic fish ticket reporting. This is kind of an example of, we implemented this requirement last year. As we rolled through the implementation, we realized we could clarify the rules better. That's what we're doing here. So the changes describes when and where electronic fish tickets must be submitted, and then includes provisions for when access to cellular service isn't available at the time that you're completing your fish ticket, and it provides clarity around when around transportation ticket requirements. And then on the small business economic impact statement, this came up in our discussion for line marking, and completely agree. This would be another important evaluation of the economic impact for our economic impact of our rule requirement. We did just that for this rulemaking package, and we hired a consultant to help us with that. It was important to us, as we contemplated a requirement that would incur a cost on stakeholders, that we do a really thorough job on evaluating what that cost was. Basically, the evaluation by the contractor did state that the rule likely imposes a more than minor cost on businesses, and that it outlined there the cost of compliance, which ranged from about $1,800 to about $2,000, and that not only would it impact, would it apply a more than minor cost, but it would potentially have a disproportionate cost on small businesses. Within the SBEIS, there were mitigation options that were at least outlined on how we thought about that. And one was removing the requirement for a logbook. Doesn't offset cost a whole lot, but it did reduce at least the burden on fishermen by not having that requirement. And then allowing flexibility in the type of electronic unit that's purchased. So really trying to open the door for like fishing associations to work with EM providers and bulk purchase or create having our rulemaking out there opens the door for EM system providers to see market competition and potentially lower prices. And then, I think that basically covers it. I also here under mitigation options is our exploration for the funding opportunities that I think is on the next slide. Yeah, so this is just going back to that slide that I jumped ahead to explain that we are working on that, and fingers crossed that we'll have some really positive news for you. I really hope we have the news before we go to the commission at the end of September. But you're all on the top of the list who will let know. So we'll probably just let the advisory board know for sure. And that includes Larry and Dale for the Fishermen's Association, so you can all spread the word. But if we do get the funding, and we're already working on this, given the high potential that we'll get it, is what does the distribution and the qualification for a system, what does that look like? So Robert and Matt are looking at what that looks like. So when we get the approval for the funding and the systems are purchased, we're ready to get those on your boats as soon as possible. So next slide. So this is just, I've been talking about this, but this is just a visual for the rulemaking timeline. We've filed what's called our CR 102. That's the proposed rule. We filed that on July 26th. It opens the door for a public comment period that'll extend through October 2nd. I think a letter went out to all the license holders and dealers today that provides you with information on the rules, where you go to provide public comment, all of that. If you'll have that here in the next day or two. And then the commission meeting is scheduled for September 28th through the 30th. The meeting is in Yakima, but there is a virtual, so it's a hybrid meeting. You don't have to be there in person to be able to provide public comment. But so you'll be able to do that virtually. I know it's not ideal to have that in a place where being in person is a little more difficult. But it was the way that the timing worked out. And it's a little bit different being able to provide public testimony. And then the final commission action would be, is scheduled for the 26th through the 28th of October. That's where the commission would make their decision. Once the commission makes their decision, the rule would be effective 31 days following that adoption. And so that puts all the rules in place by right around December 1. And so the approach for crab, and that's just doesn't provide enough of a window. So we're looking to have the requirement for January 1, 2024. But again, with the funding, there's the potential that we'll have these systems, and the process for getting them installed on your boats even before commission action is finalized. And so that'll help with that window. But again, the EM requirement would be delayed until January. Okay, next slide, Jamie. So this link, and we'll post this presentation to our agency, the Coastal Crab webpage. If anybody needs help finding that, they can contact Matt and he can help navigate people there. But there's the link to the proposed rule changes so that you can review them again in more detail. There's a link to the compliance guide, so you can look at that and let us know that there's places that could have more clarity. There's a link to that small business economic impact statement that you can look at. Next slide. And then in detail, this is also here. This will be in the letter that you'll all receive too, but there's a link to where you can make comments. We have a web portal for that. So even if you can't be at the commission meeting, you can provide your comments to this online portal. You can email them if you'd like. However, I think the letter you get also says you can provide your comment to me. And again, all these comments will be accepted through the end of the comment period on October 2nd. Having the comment period through the end of October 2nd means that we can go to the commission for their decision. And when we present to the commission, we'll be able to address the public comment that we've heard throughout the comment period, including what we heard tonight. So we've all been taking careful notes about what we've heard from you, and we can present that to the commission and address how, or explain how we've addressed the comments to them, so they have that as they prepare to make the decision. And we're a little after 5 o'clock, but happy to take any questions here. Happy to follow up with folks who have questions, sometimes processing information. You have a question tomorrow. You know, Robert is the electronic program manager and could probably answer a lot of the questions, the technical questions. Lorna and I are both available for questions about rulemaking, that sort of thing. Any of us are able to help you with any follow-up questions. Well, I also want to say how much I appreciate, there's a lot of people that attended this meeting tonight, and I really appreciate it. The idea was to just give you a first glance, a pre-glance at the rulemaking in advance of this public comment period. So we have really tried to address comments all along, and your input is helpful. This was just another opportunity to do that. Oh, I also want to say too, depending on what we hear at the September commission meeting, and as we prepare to go to the October commission meeting, we may do something like this again, if that'd be helpful. We're also going to be meeting with you during that time because we're going to be test fishing, and we're going to be talking with the tribal co-managers and starting to think about management plans. And so anyway, we're approaching that time of the year where we get together a little bit more often. So we'll be talking to you.
So there's a couple questions in the chat, Heather.
Yeah, let's see. I see Jennifer. Right. The idea here, Jennifer, is well, with the Pacific States money, well, first of all, Pacific States has already met with Archipelago and said, what are the logistics of having these systems available for Washington to meet their rule timeline? And Archipelago has said, no problem. We'll be able to do that. We won't, there's no intention to wait to order the systems, especially with the funding. We're buying them. We'll make them available to you. as soon as possible. The bulk
Robert?
order by, if you get the grant.
So, yeah, the other question was about install. Robert, could you speak to the install process?
Yeah, the installation of this, there's a couple different options. You can have someone install it. Archipelago can install it, but most of these systems they send to you and you can install yourself. And the install takes about 4 hours, 4 to 5 hours. Yeah, if there's any other questions on that, it's pretty simple install. Just hook up power, and then the most complicated part is the hydraulic pressure sensor. You have to splice that in.
We're all waiting to see your little dots. What are you typing, Lorna?
Fortunately, you see little dots when I'm like on another chat. I may not be in this one. I did
Okay.
see though that Jill Smith just had a comment there about, it wasn't a question about just the idea of how this impacts dual permitted fishermen, and just say, yes, that is not lost on Oregon or Washington managers, that there's in all of this, and particular with line marking, it's part of the conversation.
Yep, definitely. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, maybe you could, you've probably already told us, but I'm old and I forget pretty quickly. When is it that you expect to have word from Pacific states on whether or not? I mean, you made the statement, we're buying them. Well, you're not going to buy them until you get assurance on the money. So when is it that you would expect that assurance?
Yeah, I talked to Karin and Dave this week, and they're waiting. I mean, any day soon. That's the best I've got.
Yeah, well, that would be huge. There's no doubt about it.
I agree. And they recognize that. And Karin knew we were having the meeting this afternoon, and so they appreciate, they're waiting for the news themselves. So yeah.
What do they want? 17?
No, he wants a dozen.
Oh.
Just 12 for the way. So give me the rest back.
Well, everybody, thank you again. Really appreciate the conversation, and yeah, we'll be in touch. Have a good
Thank
evening.
you, Heather. And will you keep us posted on the funding?
We will. Fingers crossed.
Okay, great. Thank
Absolutely. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
You bet.
Well, they might have a funding.